Great. Thank you for joining today's Illusive webinar, Stop Advanced Ransomware Now, MITRE Shield's Active Defense and Illusive Lateral Movement Prevention. We are very lucky today to have a guest presenter, Christina Fowler, Chief Cyber Intel Strategist at MITRE and a member of the MITRE Shield team, and she'll be able to brief you today on MITRE Shield. Before we begin, just a couple of preliminary announcements and then we'll get going. One is today's webinar is being recorded and all registrants will receive a copy of the recording, likely in their email inbox tomorrow morning, so keep an eye out for that. Secondly, we would love to get your questions, which you can ask in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. And we will reserve time for questions at the end of today's session. Yeah, please keep them on topic, but we can't promise we'll get to every single question, but we'll try to do our best. And we encourage you to ask. So with all that said, I just want to get started right away. Christina, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit about MITRE Shield. I'll do a quick introduction to that and then turn it over to Wade for some use cases. So what is Shield? So MITRE Shield is an active defense knowledge base. It really is trying to get people to think about moving away from passive defense to a more active defensive stance. It's rooted in our adversary engagement operations that we run here at MITRE to research adversaries and learn more about what they do and how they operate. And it's available at shield.mitre.org. So what is active defense as far as how it's defined in Shield? It really ranges from a group of basic cyber defensive capabilities through cyber deception, lots of cyber deception concepts, up through adversary engagement operations where you're actively engaging with an adversary, basically going toe-to-toe. But the goal is for you to be able to counter your current attacks, learn more about your adversaries, and better prepare your network and your organization to withstand future attacks. So why would you want to use these concepts? Well, it really comes down to three main things. Number one, you want to detect adversaries on your network. You want to elicit tactics, techniques, and procedures from your adversaries that you've already got trapped in your network or in your deception network. And by doing that, you can also validate what you think you know about adversaries. And last but not least, and probably most importantly, you can impose cost on your adversaries, drive up their costs, and drive down the value of their attacks. So when we talk about these concepts, we're going to ask you to look at things a little bit differently than you have in the past. So most defenders will say an adversary presents a challenge to me. Well, we're going to tell you that it also presents an opportunity to do things different, to challenge your adversaries to go beyond their normal TTPs that they bring. So it's really stimulating a new way of thinking, the art of the possible. And then last but not least, active defense and the concepts in Shield and the concepts of cyber deception is really for everyone. You really do need to get past passive defense and think outside the box. If you use MITRE ATT&CK is a wonderful tool to understand the adversary's TTPs and what they do. MITRE Shield brings the other side, which is the defense side. So if you really think about MITRE ATT&CK, the adversary, MITRE Shield, the defense, they kind of have a perfect marriage, like looking in a mirror and seeing what you can do. They align really well. So in Shield, there's a MITRE ATT&CK mapping section that talks about if an adversary does this, you can counter with this technique. And it just brings that to light in a whole new way. So when we talk about MITRE Shield and the things that are in that knowledge base, the most important thing, or one of the most important things, is tactics. Tactics are your defender goals. What are you trying to accomplish as a defender? And that matters because that's how you're going to lay out your entire strategy. What cyber deception techniques are you going to use? What technologies are going to matter to you. What are you going to do as far as just basic defensive postures? All those things come down to your goals. So when you look at the MITRE Shield matrix, you'll see across the top are 8 tactics: channel, collect, contain, detect, disrupt, facilitate, legitimize, and test. So on first blush, that looks like a lot. But what we'll tell you is that most organizations are going to live in the first 5 columns of the shield matrix. You're going to try to just do some basic defensive, active defense things like, I want to channel my adversary. I want to collect on my adversary. The items on the right, the last 3, are really geared towards adversary engagement. Not a lot of people will go here initially. So, you're going to start off on the first 5. You're going to get really good at those. And then most likely later on move to the last 3 tactics of facilitate, legitimize, and test. And I'll go through those to explain what each of those are. So let's start off with channel. So channel is where you want to guide your adversary in a specific direction or down a specific path. And what you're trying to do here is steer them away from the important things, the crown jewels within your environment, and steer them towards decoy systems. You're trying to drive up their costs, waste their time, waste their resources, and really make them work hard, but on the wrong stuff. They're completely, hopefully at this point, focused on the wrong things in your network. So you're driving them away from the good stuff toward the stuff that is deceptive or of lower value. Collect as a tactic is where you want to gather information about an adversary. You want to get their tools. You want to get firsthand observations about the adversary. You want to get raw intelligence about an adversary that can really help you understand exactly what they're doing. So when you look at this, excuse me, the tactics in collect are going to really help you gather their TTPs. So you're going to look at what hours are they operating, what tools do they bring, do they develop their own tools, do they bring commodity tools. Those things help you really understand an adversary at a deeper level. Contain is where you're going to prevent an adversary from moving outside specific bounds. So you have them in your deception network. You want to keep them there. You don't want them to get outside. You don't want to have them get to their key production assets. So really walling them off, isolating them, and keeping them in a specific area. We have detect. So detect is when you are trying to just find out that the adversary is there. So maybe they are trying to break into your network, or maybe they already have, and you're trying to find them as they move laterally through your network. So that's the whole goal of detect, is gain awareness to an adversary who is coming in or is already there. Disrupt. Disrupt is a great one. You just want them to go away. You want them to not be able to conduct part or all of their mission. So you want an adversary who is trying to accomplish a specific task to not be able to do that. So that may be supplying them with misinformation. It may be in making their tools irrelevant in your network. Whatever the case may be, you're trying to keep them from accomplishing their missions, either part or in whole. So now we start to move into that area where I said that this may be not for everyone, and that's adversary engagement. Adversary engagement is where you're allowing an adversary to conduct their mission in a synthetic environment or a decoy environment to just expend their resources. So when you are doing that, you want to keep them in those deceptive networks as long as possible. So you facilitate their mission. In other words, you help them out. You enable them to spend a lot of time, spend a lot of resources, drive up their cost. And the whole time, they're really not getting anything of value. They're just spinning their wheels. So facilitate is not something you would do in a production network. It is something you would do in a deceptive network. Legitimize kind of goes towards the same thing. When you're building deceptive components, you want to make them as realistic as possible. You want to make sure that the adversary is going to believe everything is real. So you need to make sure that it's legitimate to the adversary, that it's got documents in the right places, that the user accounts are created the right way. All those things go into building that realistic environment that keeps that adversary interested and keeps their attention. And then last but not least is test. So test is where you're going to validate your understanding of an adversary. So you may believe that an adversary has specific interests or capabilities or behaviors, and test is where you're going to validate those things that you think you know. So maybe you read in an open source report that an adversary has a specific capability, but when you actually test them in your environment, you find out that they have abilities far beyond that, or that they really don't act that way after their first level of interaction. So maybe as they move deeper into your network, the behaviors completely change because they're broadcasting a facade to most people. So test is really where you can get to the ground truth of how an adversary behaves. So those are the tactics that are in Shield. So within each of those tactics are techniques, and techniques are where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So these are the actions that you're going to take to get to the goals that you're trying to accomplish. So there's 33 techniques in MITRE Shield. And so I invite you to go to the matrix and look at those. We specifically picked techniques that were very versatile, that would allow you to get different results based on how you apply the techniques. So one technique can facilitate an adversary. You can use that same technique to disrupt an adversary. So you'll see those techniques in multiple columns in the MITRE Shield matrix for specific reasons. We want them to be very flexible, high value techniques that you can leverage. So 33 techniques are very useful to counter most adversary things that they'll do. Also in MITRE Shield is the concept of opportunity spaces. Again, I mentioned this earlier. It's thinking of as a defender, what can I do to my adversary? What are the opportunities I can realize? And they can be very simple. So you can do something like deploy a tripwire that triggers, that tells you that an adversary is present in your network. Very common with deception technology. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure you know an adversary is present. If you want to do adversary engagement, same kind of thing. You could actually like use a compromised drive-by website to start an engagement with an adversary and learn about their TTPs. So opportunity spaces is just that concept of think about it from a different view than you have maybe in the past as a defender. What is the opportunity that it brings to you? And then the last concept that I want to talk about today is use cases, which is as I move through MITRE Shield and I have my goals in mind, I have my techniques in mind, I've thought about the opportunities. Use cases is now, here's how you might go and do that. Here's how you might accomplish that. So you'll see a lot of use cases throughout the knowledge base where we say, okay, here's what you could do. So if you're trying to deploy a tripwire, maybe you see decoy credentials around. Or maybe you go out and you visit that site from that compromised website from a decoy network. So we're trying to get you to think about implementations, but not specific implementations, because everybody's network, everybody's need is a little bit different. So we give you very generic use cases to stimulate your thinking about what you can do, and then have you move out in your own way to accomplish those things. So I've kind of talked about the concepts of MITRE Shield, and now I want to turn it over to Wade to give you some practical use cases.
Thanks, Christina, for that valuable presentation. It was really informative. We're going to hear now from Wade Lentz. He's the field CTO at Illusive Networks, and he's going to look at taking some of the ideas behind active defense and applying them to a specific use case of identifying advanced ransomware attackers. So Wade, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Jason. Thanks, Christina. So we want to get down to the practical. We're really excited about the shield and attack frameworks. And so with the time we have remaining, I want to talk in a little more detail about how deception provides an active defense, how to mature into that space. And then we're going to look at applying this active defense methodology to one of the most destructive attacks that we're facing now as security teams, this advanced ransomware threat. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how advanced ransomware threats operate and how an active defense really changes the security posture in this, one of the most destructive attacks that are out in this space today. And then we'll do a success story. We'll kind of talk about one particular case that is pretty indicative of the model of an active defense really changing the security posture, and then we'll finish up with the Q&A. So don't hesitate to drop those questions into the Q&A section, and we look forward to addressing those. So moving forward, ransomware attacks, interesting recent study that since COVID and the work from home movement, I think earlier this spring, we've seen a jump kind of across various industries of 100% in ransomware attacks. And what's particularly troubling is that this uptick in attacker pace, if you will, has coincided with really pretty dramatic shifts in user behavior. And so it's been a real challenging problem for a lot of security teams. One of the things in particular is that a lot of detection and prevention methods out there have relied on anomaly-based or pattern-based recognition and detection. And of course, with the work from home movement, the baselines are all out the window. And so it's a really dangerous environment where at the exact same time when the attack pace is increasing, the defenses are actually struggling to keep up with shifts in the environment. And this makes sense, right? Attackers have identified the fact that there's an opportunity and they're leveraging more aggressive movements, particularly in ransomware and other methods to exploit this opportunity. So this has been a #1 topic for security teams, and we think that that's going to continue. So I wanted to take a minute and talk about the advanced ransomware threat and really define it with a little more clarity. So traditional ransomware, the old spray and pray, I think people are pretty familiar with that. That's where really the ransomware acts on the beachhead system as quickly as possible, right? Ransomware hits the system. The first thing it does is it begins to encrypt the local system and then also reach out across the network and encrypt any systems that it can get access to, kind of the classic spray and pray ransomware methodology. Well, really, in the last year, and particularly in the last 6 months, we've seen a dramatic shift in from just that method to a much more dangerous method, in some cases called the advanced ransomware threat. And the advanced ransomware threat is where there's this combination of APT methods and the use of ransomware. So rather than the attacker executing ransomware the moment they get the beachhead, what the attacker is doing is establishing a beachhead and then moving laterally against systems, attempting to identify crown jewel systems, moving very surgically throughout the environment. Once they've established those systems, then leveraging ransomware against the most critical assets in the environment. And so huge uptick in this, particularly into the fall. We expect this to continue throughout the months over the winter. So let's look at this in a little more detail. This really is the attacker exploiting what they understand as a deficiency for most security teams, right? How do they take advantage of a blind spot? So when they establish a beachhead on the initial system, again, encryption not used at this point. They're holding that weapon in reserve. So you can see here, this particular system, the red dot, we've got a compromised system in the environment. The next step in the process is the attacker takes the time to make sure that they have persistence on the endpoint, that they've got detection, evasion in place, maybe hammering EDR or validating that their tools won't be detected, their methods won't be detected by endpoint protection. Once that persistence and detection evasion has been established, the attacker brings down additional tools and begins the process of moving laterally throughout the environment in order to identify high value assets, crown jewel systems. And with advanced ransomware, we've seen intentional attacks against backup and recovery systems in order to make sure that the organization's backups will not be helpful after the ransomware has been executed. And the critical thing here is that the attacker has to go through a decision-making process to decide how to move through the environment, what systems are critical, where to go, how to get access to these systems. And this is where we have an opportunity with an active defense to really poison the attacker's methods, use those against them before they reach critical assets and into crown jewel systems. So as we think about this part of the attack cycle, I want to draw your attention back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We know a lot of security teams have been leveraging MITRE ATT&CK because it allows us to look at the attacker methods through the attack cycle and map our defenses. Do we have a consistent detection and response capability throughout the entire process? So notice down at the bottom of this slide, in the attack framework, you've got endpoint controls, next-gen AV, EDR, really looking at phase 1 through 5 of the attacker process. How do we use endpoint controls and other controls to defend the endpoints, try to resist execution of malicious processes, try to prevent privilege escalation and persistence on the endpoints. And a lot of security teams have solid capabilities in this space. It's the next phase of the attack where the attacker has been successful in establishing persistence and privilege escalation that they now begin to move throughout the environment. Now, typically this is described as being lateral movement, which is specific just to phase 8, but really it involves phases 6 through 9, where the attacker is looking to get at privileged credentials, looking to discover other hosts throughout the network, then actually in the lateral movement phase, actually moving against those systems, and then beginning to collect data from the environment. And what we found with security teams is that this phase of MITRE 6 through 9 is really the more difficult and challenging area for security teams to get a grip on. Later phases, again, EDR and DLP both provide some controls for phases 10 and 11, but this phase 6 through 9 becomes the most difficult. And we see this in the statistics. 53% of attacks infiltrate unnoticed, 68% of ransomware attacks unnoticed, over 90% of attacks didn't generate an alert. And so we believe that there's this huge opportunity with an active defense to leverage this traditional weakness that we know attackers have been leveraging against us, right? This ability to move undetected in phases 6 through 9 of the MITRE ATT&CK sequence. So let's talk about how we're going to apply a lateral threat management capability against specifically advanced ransomware attacks. Now, the good news is that lateral threat management obviously applies to all kinds of attacks, right? Insiders, nation state attacks, the advanced ransomware threat. And here's really the two facets of this capability. First, actively reducing the attack surface, proactively reach into the environment and identify lateral movement opportunities and pathways and clean the environment so that we're not providing the attacker the easy movement throughout the environment. This is a critical phase. And look, as security teams, we know that this is a problem because As security organizations do red team exercises and penetration tests, we see very consistently that once in our own exercises, once an attacker, our red teamer in this case, gets a beachhead, they tend to be effective moving through the environment using living off the land methods. This tends to be a very effective method. So we want to reduce that attack surface, deny the attacker this easy movement. The next phase is where we then use a deception-powered threat detection capability to proactively tell deceptive stories in the environment that make it extremely difficult and expensive for an attacker to operate. And this is particularly effective against advanced ransomware, where it's necessary for the attacker to identify crown jewel systems, and active detection using deception gives us a huge advantage in the space. So let's walk through these two elements in a little more detail. So in this visualization, you can see here kind of a sample small network. Everything that you're seeing in green represents hosts, production hosts in the environment. And then the little white dots represent data that lives on the production systems. So the crowns represent connection strings to crown jewels, whether those are URLs and URIs stored in the browser, or IP addresses or FQDNs, whatever it may be, different applications. And then the little people icons represent credentials that are stored on the production network. And we find this consistently, this kind of residue of normal operations is present in all environments. And so the first step in going active is to reduce this attack surface. And so we have a capability at Illusive to examine this data and to, using targeted security best practice rules, identify the low-hanging fruit that an attacker is going to leverage in a lateral movement process. And so Advanced Ransomware is also looking for this information, how to leverage this. And so as security teams, we need to get visibility into this and proactively remove this information. So the next step in the process is to reach into these production systems and eliminate this low-hanging fruit. And it could be local Windows administrator accounts, cache, domain, credentials, connection strings in the browser that include credentials to crown jewels, any of this kind of residue of normal operations that makes it very easy on an attacker to move and identify crown jewel systems. Step one, reduce the attack surface, get proactive about cleanup, and deny the attacker the easy movement. Now, the next stage in the process is we're going to really turn the pressure up on the attacker. In this case, we're back now to a cleaned environment. We've reduced what we can. We've eliminated connection strings and credentials wherever possible. But as we all know, networks function and exist based on networking, right? Credential and connection. There's no way to ever clean all this information. Data will always persist. And as an attacker, if I get a beachhead in this environment and I simply use the credential and connection data that I find on the beachhead to move against other production systems, A, I'm highly likely to be successful, and B, behavioral systems are not going to have a problem with this. There's already precedent for this behavior. It's going to look normal. So at Illusive, what we do is then backplant deceptive information onto the production systems in this environment. So all the orange data that you see here are deceptive stories that are being told on production assets, right? This is browser history of interacting with deceptive entities that don't actually exist in the environment. It's credentials planted in memory and in the Windows cache. It's a history of interactive sessions between the production systems and deceptive entities using administrative tools like RDP or WinSCP, PuTTY, and FileZilla. So this kind of deceptive storytelling and backplanning really makes it difficult for an attacker, because no matter where they land in the environment on a production system, they will immediately be confronted by deception on that system. And this creates a couple of things. First of all, if an attacker is using automation to move laterally in this environment, they will be detected immediately, because the vast majority of the credential and connection information that they're seeing on the beachhead is deceptive in nature. The second thing is that as they begin to be detected and cleaned off the systems, they realize if they're persistent that there's an advanced detection capability in the space, there's deception in operation. So if an attacker persists and continues from other beachheads, they won't be able to use automation, and they'll slow down the pace of their attack. They begin to dig into very deep levels of detail, trying to understand what's real and what's deceptive in this environment. And this is where the cost of the attack goes up exponentially for the attacker. In many cases, they get frustrated. It's not possible to move successfully in many cases, and so they just move on down the line. Just too expensive to operate in this environment. Go to the next target. So one of the great things about the deception-driven detection is that it's only when an attacker has violated security policy and identified this deceptive information and then used it in an attempt to move laterally, that's when we provide an alert, say, hey, someone's using deceptive information to move in the environment. We've got a very high fidelity alert. It's not based on behavioral analytics or the probability that this is malicious. This is absolutely something that is a big threat in the environment, something security teams want to pay attention to immediately. One of the great things about the Illusive solution is that we provide an on-demand forensics capability directly on the source system of the attack itself. And what's great about this is, look, we're not really trying to lure an attacker into a honeypot and get them to believe that that honeypot is real and then get them to do something interesting on that system. The attacker's already leveraging the production host. And at Illusive, we're in a position to gather real-time forensics information directly off the source system, the production system where the attacker is operating. And this is a dramatic enhancement for the security team in understanding their attacker in real time as this is playing out in the environment. And so it's been extremely effective for security teams looking to, again, become proactive, establish an active defense. This is a great part of that capability. So, using MITRE Shield to go from a reactive to an active defense, I wanted to point out a couple of things. The first point here, a lot of security automation today, and look, at Illusive, we're giant fans of security automation, right? We should automate everything that's possible for us to do as security teams. However, if you think about it, a lot of security automation today is in fact reactive. What we're doing is responding to something that has already happened in the environment with automation. And we should, right? We should do that work, but let's don't confuse traditional security automation with creating an active defense, because in many cases, it's just speeding up our reaction, but it's not going to get us into an active defense. Deception really changes the game because now we're becoming proactive about setting traps for the attacker, right? We're changing the dynamic so that if you think about it, without deception, everything the attacker sees in the environment is real. Everything the attacker does allows them to learn more about our security, more about our defenses, more about our capabilities, and more about our environment. The attacker is already learning at every phase. With a deception capability, we're now changing that game, and much or most of what the attacker is learning about the environment, in fact, isn't real, right? We're wasting their effort. And then the last thing is that deception detection is deterministic, right? It's not based on probability or anomaly. Again, the user had to violate security policy to identify the deceptive information. So as an example, the normal user is not going to run Mimikatz or Windows credential editor in order to scrape credentials out of memory and then attempt a Kerber roasting or pass the hash method in order to gain access to a remote system. I mean, when we get a detection and someone has done that, they've scraped a credential out of memory and used it against another system, that's not a probability of malicious behavior. That's not anomalous behavior. That's deterministic detection. This is a malicious action that's being carried out and a top line issue for the security team to respond to right away. Really seeing through the noise in the modern SOC. So one of the things that gets exciting for our security teams, they realize that, look, attackers have been using automation to create manual work for security teams. And look, as security teams, if we're just responding to the attacker's automation, we will never win this fight. But with a deception platform like Illusive, now the security team is using an automated platform to create manual work for the attacker. We are completely changing the dynamic, and this is one of the things that allows a security team to get to an active defense, right? Stripping away the attacker's automation, as a matter of fact, using that automation against them if they attempt to move laterally with tools of that nature. So let's look right down into the details right out of MITRE Shield. One of the first examples, particularly effective in the ransomware, advanced ransomware context, is decoy content. Now, again, we just pulled this quote right out of the MITRE Shield structure. I think it's completely applicable. I just want to draw your attention to this line that says, decoy content is data used to tell a story to an adversary, right? This is automated deception storytelling that really changes the dynamic. And look, attackers are so used to being able to rely on what they read and see from the beachhead that we can use that method against them. So whether this is credentials or connections, what's critical about the data is good deception can't be deception out of a bucket. It has to be customized and tuned for the environment, right? It has to be targeted to the individual systems that it's planted on. It has to be good stories so that it's believable, right? Christina brought this up earlier. It needs to be logical, believable. It needs to be kept fresh and interesting. You can't plant deception at 3 months and not touch it. It'll go stale, right? So great deception storytelling is how deception platforms keep the decoy content relevant and effective. And from an Illusive perspective, one of the most important things is that this content be told on production systems, right? This battle is going to be won or lost on the beachhead where the attacker first establishes presence. One of the things that we're so excited about in Illusive is that our decoy content is so believable. The deceptive stories are so good that they're effective against insiders. And that's how you know that you're doing great deception storytelling, is that even the insider, the employee, the contractor, the vendor, the person that we gave the beachhead to, right? The security, the IT team, here's your laptop. Even that person is not able to see through these stories, and they're lured into interacting with the deceptive data that we planted on the production systems, this decoy content. The next piece that's super, super effective are decoy credentials. Seeding the production systems, target systems, in particular production systems with deceptive credentials. This is, again, classic deception methodology. You say, look, if this is such a classic deception play, why isn't everyone doing this? And I'll tell you, the reason has been being effective at deception has really required some automation that hasn't traditionally been available, right? Traditional deception platforms just required too much manual work in order to be effective. So at Illusive, the decoy credential platform, again, doesn't just take deception out of a bucket and start scattering it all over the place and hoping. What we're doing is telling stories, even with the credentials that we plant on the production system. The idea being to give the attacker a logical, believable reason for this credential to be present and a story around how that credential could be leveraged against other systems. And those credentials can be put in the registry, in the memory, in different locations, in a way to get the attacker to reveal themselves. Again, if the attacker bashes their way into a separate profile, a separate user's profile on a Windows system, and then pulls credentials out of another user's profile on the hard drive, and then leverages that information, it's clearly malicious, right? So then the last point, of course, are having good decoy systems, right? Target systems that we can use for detection to receive the inbound connection attempts. Again, all this has to be orchestrated in a way that tells logical, believable stories, and it has to be kept fresh and interesting at the organizational level, at the VLAN and subnet level, and then right down to every single individual system. So automation and great storytelling is essential to be effective at this stage in the process. Okay, so jumping back to the Shield framework, I want to draw your attention to the different elements here. I really like something that Christina said, pointing out that channel and collect and contain and detect and disrupt, the first 5 elements are really for everybody, right? The days of having a passive defense be enough are gone and going away even more quickly. So facilitate, legitimize, and test. Certainly a ton of value can be leveraged by more mature security operations, but every security team can take advantage of the first 5 elements in MITRE Shield and should. The next thing to understand is if you look at the Illusive capabilities, the grayed out areas are things that we don't do a whole lot with. The individual tactics in black are areas where Illusive does provide substantive capability, but look at the orange areas. Everything listed in orange is a technique that requires deception. It's not possible to get to an active defense in these areas without leveraging deception as a method. So we think this is a great driver. The time for deception is now. The MITRE Shield framework is really showing organizations how to apply deception effectively. And this is a great way to help security teams kind of understand specifically how this can make their lives better by moving into an active defense, leveraging the Shield structure. Okay, so as promised, the last thing we're going to get into is an actual case study against an advanced ransomware attack. In this case, the target customer of Illusive was an online retailer. They're obviously a recognizable entity with broad coverage around the globe. And the summary here is that there was detection of a suspicious interaction with a print server, and we'll talk about that in some more detail. And the activity was a phishing-driven attack that was intended to leverage ransomware. So this is an advanced ransomware threat. It's going to be a partnership between APT methodologies and ransomware as the final end goal. Let's look at how the attack was carried out. So what the attacker did was structure a COVID-19 phishing email that was highly targeted to the organization in question, and that this attack was carried out before Illusive was deployed in the environment. The attacker established a beachhead and then moved against other systems and really established a base of operations on one particular print server. From the original beachhead and other environments, they were able to move laterally to a number of systems, actually a fairly high number of systems, using RDP and WMI in this environment. And what's critical to note is that they were actually able to span domains. Wasn't limited just to a particular series of VLANs or subnets or OUs. It encompassed large numbers of systems across domains. They leveraged some domain trusts that were established. Some of the tools used by this attacker, a bunch of living off the land methods, Mimikatz and Bloodhound, Sharphound leveraged to understand the environment, then Metasploit looking for different vulnerabilities and what could function in this environment. TrickBot, Cobalt Strike Beacon, a number of tools. And this attack was able to play out until Illusive was deployed in this environment. So the timeline looks pretty much like this. The attacker gains a foothold in the environment with a fairly targeted phishing email about COVID-19. The attacker then bypassed EDR on that beachhead and established persistence in the environment, and then begin to move aggressively using living off the land motion against a high number of systems in the environment. And we saw a foothold, again, not just on an individual beachhead, but dozens and dozens of systems across multiple domains. The next step in the process is that Illusive was deployed in the environment. It's a fairly large environment, so it's, again, a two-step process. First of all, cleaning the environment, reducing the attack surface, going into production systems and eliminating that low-hanging fruit, the exact RDP data, connection string data that the attacker had been leveraging in the environment to move, doing that cleanup, and then back planning elusive deceptive data into the production environment. This is done incrementally in a very targeted way, but also done at fairly dramatic scale in order to understand, in order to get a solid capability in very short order. Within 24 hours of Illusive being deployed, the attacker interacted with a deceptive story on a production host. So very quickly, the attacker was fooled into believing that a deceptive story on a production system was real, attempted to use the objects that we planted to move against what they thought were important systems in the environment, leveraging what they thought were privileged credentials in that environment. Note that time, within 24 hours, immediate success in identifying that this attack is moving in this environment. So here's where the forensics and collection happens. Again, on demand, Illusive Forensics pulled a ton of information from the original system. We had a very clear story of how the beachhead was functioning that was detected initially. And all the indicators that Illusive gathered off of that first production system, the security team was then able to leverage those indicators and Illusive on-demand forensics and their other tools to identify dozens of other compromised machines in this environment. And so this played out across a matter of days in the space, identifying the systems, and then choices were made about when to isolate systems and how to, once the belief was they had good controls of where the attacker was operating, to implement guardrails and isolation and containment against the entire beachhead that the attacker had established all at once. We know for a fact that if you show your hand and only quarantine a few beachheads, the attacker realizes that they're under attack and will respond aggressively with the systems they still have presence on. So it's critical to get them across the board, and Illusive on-demand forensics provided the information necessary to perform that action. What was interesting was that the IR team, examining all of the compromised systems, identified inside the attacker toolkits both TrickBot and Ryuk ransomware variants. And the idea here was, it became apparent that the attacker was moving against crown jewel systems, and had they been able to get to the systems they had intended to get access to, that Ryuk ransomware would be the final phase of the attack. And what's the great news here is that ransomware encryption on the estate was prevented because we were able to detect this advanced ransomware attacker using an active defense and eliminating the low-hanging fruit and using a deceptive methodology to make their lives extremely painful. And again, that's what we're looking for in these more sophisticated attacks. How do we prevent the end state for the attacker? So thank you very much for your time. I wanted to end with a few minutes left so that there'd be time to entertain your questions, both for Christina and for myself. So Jason, let me turn it back over to you, and we'll see what questions we've got from the audience today.
Great. Thank you very much, Wade, for your presentation. I'll just read, actually, before I even read some of the things on the screen, I just wanted to remind people that the way you can ask questions is in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. We do have about 10 minutes to answer some of these, so we'll get to it in 1 second. Just a few different options you can have if you want to learn more about Illusive and our capabilities with MITRE Shield. You can see on the screen. I particularly want to direct your attention to the bottom. We actually do have a white paper mapping full Illusive capabilities to the Shield techniques. We'll send a copy of the white paper in the webinar follow-up email, but you can also find it at the link above. Hopefully that's interesting for you. Okay, so let's get to some questions. Christina, I think this one is for you. And I think it's related to the technique of application diversity. What resources would you recommend for novice defenders to implement the defense techniques, for example, DPR 0007, using a mix of vulnerable and no vulnerable software in a system to allow you to see what exploits the adversary leverages in their attacks? What are examples of vulnerable and non-vulnerable software, and what should we leverage to see what exploits are used?
Okay, that's a great question. So when you're looking at trying to use a mix of vulnerable and non-vulnerable, so this is when you're setting up your deception or your adversary engagement network. So what you might do is maybe you see that a certain CVE is being exploited. So maybe it's a Internet Explorer vulnerability or Microsoft Windows vulnerability, whatever the case may be. If you have multiple systems in your network that you're in your deception network and your deception system, you may patch some and not patch others, so that as an adversary is going through the network and they're doing scans and they're saying what is vulnerable, what is not vulnerable, they actually see a mix, because that's what you would see in a normal production environment. You'd see some users have patched, some users have not. So that's kind of what we're driving out here with the concept of a mix of vulnerable and non-vulnerable. You patch a few, but you leave some open to that exploit. How you would actually see the adversary exploiting that box depends on your network, depends on how you have it instrumented. Maybe you have some host space detection. Maybe you're doing full packet capture. Maybe you're just doing some really good monitoring using some other tools. Whatever the capabilities you have, you're going to want to make sure that you're collecting as many data points as possible off of those systems, and have as much visibility as possible, especially, like I said, in a adversary engagement situation where you're going toe-to-toe intentionally with an adversary. As much visibility as you absolutely can architect into that environment is critical to watch for these things.
Great, thank you. I'll try to alternate. Some questions will be for Wade, some questions are for Christina, but Wade, we'll give you one that just came in actually a minute ago. Do these fake deceptive data in the environment create noise in the SIM, and how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what the question reveals is that, you know, kind of older automated deception platforms were noisy because it was necessary for those systems to kind of create actual connections and actual interactions and actual, you know, live sessions between production systems and deception systems. And these can be detected as, you know, that they're actually happening and create noise in the SIM. So what's important is to be able to do good deception storytelling on the production systems that's just tied to system history, right? You're not actually creating real events in the environment that will put noise into the SIM or create false alerts or confuse behavioral systems, right? What we're doing is just telling a story on the production system in the registry and in the memory and various locations throughout the hard drive, as if this production system has interacted with these other systems. And it's a great way to do deception storytelling that doesn't create any noise. Now, to be effective, then you do have to come back to that system and keep that story fresh by modifying those histories. And that's a great question. So yeah, happy to answer.
Great. Christina, what are some future plans for MITRE Shield as cybersecurity and as attacker techniques evolve?
Yeah, great question. So, so we've got a couple of things coming out very soon from MITRE Shield. So MITRE ATT&CK just published version 8 of their framework, which adds some new adversary tactics. So you'll see coverage in Shield coming for those. You'll also see us map to the attack group mappings that they have. So a lot of people care about specific adversaries of, hey, I'm really interested in this one adversary that has haunted me for a long time. So we're going to give you some adversary specific mappings by leveraging the attack group mappings. So that'll be coming soon. And then we're going to be moving probably first of next year to a play structure in Shield where right now, the way it's laid out is single technique counters. So maybe you use decoy credentials, maybe you look at decoy counts, maybe you look at a decoy system. But really, in actuality, what you'll find when you're doing this stuff is you layer techniques together. You combine them in logical ways, which is what most deception vendors do. So we're going to introduce the concept of plays in Shield, where we will say, if you take these 2 or 3 or 4 techniques and put them together as a group and use them, there's a lot of power in that. So, we hope that will really give people a lot of new ways of looking at this same active defense problem.
Great. Thank you. Wade, something about ransomware and Active Directory. If ransomware attackers can gain access to an LDAP platform like Active Directory and steal credentials, can't they easily find and access their target?
Right. And look, the question reveals this consistent pressure that we're under as security teams around credential stealing, right? Active Directory is an LDAP structure that is, I mean, the whole purpose of Active Directory is to make data available to production systems, right? It's all about being able to query it. So, there are simple queries inherent in Windows and other structures. DS query is a great way where you can simply query Active Directory and it'll tell you all kinds of great information, right? It'll tell you, what are the privileged groups and who are the members and what's the password policy and where are the domain controllers. And it's important that Active Directory do this. Unfortunately, attackers are fully aware of this and they leverage this at every phase. And so one of the things that's important in doing good deception storytelling is to work with Active Directory to make sure that the deceptive stories make sense and that both the deceptive entities and the deceptive credentials tie in with the actual production Active Directory. And this is a great way, since we know attackers are going to leverage this information to make sure that some of the information that they're seeing is falsified. Now, one thing I will say is I've seen solutions that attempt to modify Active Directory queries from production systems, and I would hesitate to use that method. It can be problematic for operational teams that are trying to troubleshoot systems and whatnot. So, yeah, making sure, understanding that your attacker is going to leverage Active Directory both for credentials and for hosts. Is a first step in seeding that environment with deceptive information.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more, maybe 2. We'll see. Christina, maybe you can take this one. Are there any legal issues with deception strategy, such as entrapment or something like that, or more broadly with aggressive defensive techniques in general?
That's a good question. So we get that a lot. So one of the things that we're careful about is the adversaries coming to us. We're not going to the adversary. We're not taking the fight to the adversary. We're letting the adversary come and engage. So there's no entrapment. They're taking the action on their own behalf. So the other piece that's really important is all the actions that we're doing from an active defense is on our network. We're defending our territory. So we aren't going, again, we're not going to the adversary's machine and doing anything. All the deception is in our network, things that we physically control. So the legal question doesn't really come up as much. We're not entrapping. They're here willingly. They came to us and they're operating on our machines. So we have a lot more freedom there. We do really want people to have legal buy-in from their organization, make sure their lawyers are on board. But, you know, again, we're not going to take the fight to the adversary. We're not going to extend to bounds that are not ours and cross any of those borders.
Okay. Wade, there was one final question, just, I think you covered it, just about like somebody was saying if we have an EDR solution to protect our endpoints and we have a SIM that gives us forensics, and where does deception kind of add additional value? Where does Illusive add more value to that?
Yeah, I think that's really the whole point of looking at MITRE Shield and looking at, you know, the suggestions that are coming out of security's best practices to say, listen, you know, the traditional defenses, the EDRs, the SIMs, all that kind of stuff, we need that stuff, right? Firewalls, you know, that's part of your passive defense, right? That's part of your reactive defensive capabilities, and that's an important capability. But the time has come to leverage an active defense, and Shield is the structure that really shows organizations how to do that. So this is a new layer that is really coming into its own. And a great way for security teams to mature their security capability without replacing other solutions. Excellent.
Thank you all for joining us. I just want to one more time thank our presenters, Christina Fowler, Chief Cyber Intel Strategist and member at MITRE and member of the MITRE Shield team, and Wade Lance, Field CTO at Illusive Networks. Just a reminder also that we have recorded this webinar and you should receive a copy of the recording tomorrow in your email inbox. We do appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we wish you continued health and success going forward, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.